Okay, here we are. I'm going to read and talk about a poem today as usual, but the poem may, I don't want to lead the witness, but the poem may impress some people as unusual and maybe confounding. But of course, the unusual, the confounding, the strange all have honored places here, so we're going to just smash ahead with it, though the heavens fall. So this is also the first poem that I've talked about that is a translation into English from another language, in this case, Portuguese. I haven't really avoided doing this because I don't think poetry and translation should be avoided. I don't think that it should be there should be any kind of barrier there. I can see it. I don't consider it unreasonable or absurd at all to be concerned about whether translating a poem from one language to another might entail unacceptable or disfiguring losses of sound and sense and reference or what have you. But I don't, as I say, I don't think that consideration should form a barrier to reading translated poetry. There are some very fine translators out there. And I don't think the strength of a poem can be suppressed by a translation, provided it's a competent one, even if certain specific, for example, acoustical effects might be lost. A phrase, say, that chimes with special felicity in its original language, but not so much in English. I think a good translator will find other ways to preserve the poem's distinctive and its essential qualities and preserve the integrity of the poem. But there will be instances where you could localize some aspect of it, some line where the translation doesn't match match it in the original. I can give one example. I do read Spanish, and that's the way to put it. I can read Spanish. I can go to a Spanish-speaking country and do fine. I've never lived in a Spanish-speaking culture any length of time, so I've never had an immersion experience. So I don't call myself fluent, but I can read more or less whatever I want, and I have somewhat slower than I read in English, but I can do it. And I have a poem here by I'm not going to read the whole thing because I don't want to talk about more than one poem, and this isn't the one for today. But I have this poem I have the Poesia Completa of Borges here, and there's a poem here that I like very much called El Sur, which means the South, and he's sitting on a bench in this kind of wooded area or place with lots of vegetation and whatnot. He's looking at the stars and he's having various kinds of thoughts and he's being stimulated in various ways. And he ends the poem by noting the odor of the jasmine and the honeysuckle and the silence of the birds sleeping and the arc of this kind of passageway and the humidity. And he says, I'll read it in Spanish, "Esas cosas acaso son el poema," and that means those things perhaps are the poem. Those things perhaps are the poem. There's nothing particularly wrong with that line. It doesn't clang or anything like that. But it's a shabby cousin at best next to "Esas cosas acaso son el poema" in an acoustical sense, in a musical sense. In the English, it's pretty flat. I don't have a translation here. That's just how I'm translating it. A gifted translator of poetry might find a better way to say that has a little bit more music in it and preserve some of the music of the original Spanish. But the music of the original Spanish is very nice. "Esas cosas acaso son el poema." All those repeated C's and S's and the short A sounds and the accentual momentum of it is just much more pleasing, and there's just much more going on there than the fairly flat, comparatively flat, "those things perhaps are the poem." So that's one thing. But I think a person who translates this and who really knows what he or she is doing would find a way to make it to preserve the essential qualities of the poem, despite moments like that and despite trade-offs like that, I suppose is the way to put it, and make it still worthwhile. So I would not, if if you're thinking, and especially with poetry, you may consider it a more acute problem with poetry than it would be for prose fiction, just because of the way language is used in poetry versus in prose. But anyway, for what it's worth, I wouldn't worry about that. So, and anyway, in this case, the poem we're going to do that, I'm much less concerned about that with the poem we're going to do today than I might be with another, mainly because the language in the poem that I'm going to look at today is so supremely simple and blunt and elemental. This is a poem called "In the Middle of the Road" by the great Brazilian poet Carlos Drummond de Andrade. I will refer to him as Drummond henceforth. And I come to him through Mark Strand, one of my very favorite poets, who has very enthusiastic about Drummond and Strand has passed away, has translated a number of his poems, and in fact, he, along with Elizabeth Bishop, are probably more responsible than any other people for whatever renown Drummond has in the English-speaking world, because the two of them did some really nice translations of his poems. So good on you, Mark and Elizabeth, wherever you may be. Okay, so I'll read the poem. In the Middle of the Road. In the middle of the road there was a stone. There was a stone in the middle of the road. There was a stone in the middle of the road. There was a stone. Never should I forget this event in the life of my fatigued retinas. Never should I forget that in the middle of the road there was a stone. There was a stone in the middle of the road. In the middle of the road there was a stone. And there you have it. And if you're thinking right now something along the lines of WTF, well, I guess I can understand that, but I think there's things in this poem that are actually very interesting, and I'm going to try to poke into them. So we have a 10-line poem comprising 2 stanzas, one of 4 lines, one of 6. The most conspicuous feature, I suppose, of this poem, or the main thing we find it to be doing, is this obsessive repetition of the line, "In the middle of the road there was a stone." It occurs a few times in exactly those words, and a few times in inverted form with the clauses reversed, and then twice in truncated form, dropping the prepositional phrase altogether and saying only there was a stone. So that recursive set of movements with very minor, maybe even trivial variations constitutes almost the whole of the poem. The only place where the speaker breaks off from repeatedly and bluntly reporting this fact to us and begins in some kind of way to suggest what that fact means to him is at the beginning of the second stanza, where he characterizes his encounter with the stone as an unforgettable sensory event. The exact words are, "Never should I forget this event in the life of my fatigued retinas." And then "Never should I forget that in the middle of the road," and then there he goes. There he goes back. But if as you're reading, and I'll come back to the fatigued retinas, but if you had been reading up to that point and had taken that pivot toward something other than the stone as a hopeful sign of further and more varied development to come, then you may have been disappointed by the poem's return to the compulsively repetitive and defiantly unvaried observation about the stone and where it lay. The speaker is describing and characterizing as something quite dramatic and transfixing what would commonly be seen surely as about as mundane and unremarkable an experience as there can be. There he is standing in a road or maybe alongside of it, and he sees a stone there. Not necessarily something you'd rush home to tell the wife about, but he seems stunned and overwhelmed by what would be just this detail in his visual field. It seems to become the entire world for him for a few moments, and there seems, at least at first, you consider the language of the poem and what it's telling you, and the intonation, his reaction. There seems to be a pretty gigantic disproportion between how he formulates verbally what he sees on the one hand, and on the other, his astonished response to it. The kind of stupor that it seems to throw him into. He describes it in language that doesn't give us anything to hold on to, anything that satisfyingly accounts for the strong feelings it triggers in him. It's just a stone in the road. From that point of view, the language seems not just elemental and unadorned, but impoverished, inadequate, not furnishing a predicate by which we can understand the speaker's response to seeing it. It's matter of fact and deadpan. Maybe dazed is the better word to describe its intonation. The presence of the stone has startled and astonished him, it seems, into this, as I say, kind of stupor in which he just helplessly and perhaps monotonously repeats that brute fact. He seems to be experiencing its sudden emergence into his visual field and his consciousness as a kind of staggering blow. We see the language itself staggering and struggling and kind of stuttering, and these helpless repetitions, this inability to find any better way to say it. He labors to come to terms with what he's seeing, to absorb it, or perhaps better say to penetrate it, and gain access to its meaning or its essence. And he only finds himself stuck, just resolutely barred from what he seeks. So he seems to be locked in a kind of futile struggle for meaning and understanding. And he keeps ramming the castle door over and over and over again and never getting in. He gets nowhere. The poem seems to go nowhere. And the reader doesn't seem to get anywhere. As a reader, you kind of enter a rut from which you never emerge. But this is where it's interesting, I think. What he's doing, how he's engaging your attention and your expectations as you read the poem, and what he does with them. I would say, in the first place, that the poem is being very, very sly, in fact, very cunning about symbolism. I think it's playing upon your desire for, or your expectation that the stone represent or symbolize something else. And in a way, it does do that, but in the way you want it to, it doesn't. So I'll try to explain what I mean. The stone may be considered symbolic of the struggle for meaning, but if it's that, it is in a way that undermines, it seems, and destabilizes, very ironically for an inert object like a stone, the entire project or procedure of symbolism in presenting the stone as this intractable and immutable terminus, a dead end that doesn't point to or lead to any other thing or idea or any other significance except the idea of its, you might say, stony indifference to any and all of that. On the other hand, isn't this, in its very failure to signify, itself resoundingly significant? Isn't it why the speaker characterizes his encounter with it as an unforgettable event? When you try to approach it as a possible symbol, you seem to enter a hall of mirrors where symbolism and the failure of symbolism reflect each other infinitely, or spark some kind of dialectic that's never resolved, in which the depth of the idea of the stone is the illusion or impossibility, maybe better to say unknowability of depth, or inaccessibility to depth. And you're suspended in this indeterminacy in which symbol perpetually articulates and undermines itself at the same time. I think it's really beautifully poetic that this inert, inanimate, mute object, a stone, stability itself, immobility itself, a dead, closed off, unresonant thing, that it's so traumatically destabilizing for the consciousness perceiving it. The speaker seems to be having an experience not unknown to me, and I'm sure not to you either, one in which the humblest and most unremarkable and taken for granted thing that you encounter as you go about your life can, when you're in a certain mood, I guess, suspend you in this kind of thrum of deep strangeness or uncanniness. Why is that thing the way it is? Why is it there? Why is anything anywhere? Why is there something rather than nothing? As I think Heidegger posed the question, you may be kind of spellbound by its otherness in relation to you, its inaccessibility in itself to you, or you may, or begin thinking about your perception of it, your consciousness of it, your consciousness itself, your reliance on your senses as a guide to the world outside of yourself, and your awareness that they can be a poor guide because of their limitations or their propensity to mislead you and deceive you at times. You can find yourself in a sort of chain of reflections that keep opening doors in your mind and spirit, or beginning to sort of particularize into specific forms and questions the whole vast field of what can't be known, in a way that's very dizzying and very powerful. And you're in this wordless place whose mystery both calls forth and pitilessly repels our desire to know. And that, among other things, is or can be an experience of the sublime in art. So anyway, if you've never had an experience like that in one of life's in-between moments, I'm afraid we can't be friends. Oh, I'm kidding. I'm very broad-minded. It's significant, I think, that I mentioned the fatigued retinas before, that the speaker, speaking of perception and so forth, that the speaker makes reference to his fatigued retinas, to his perceptual apparatus, and the suggestion of its being an inadequate guide to the world outside of us, as I just mentioned. That world outside of us, what Lacan called the big other. So then, is it finally a poem about an object in the world external to human consciousness, or is it about human consciousness and perception? Probably the latter. Then I'll say one last thing about the repetition in it. At first, largely because of what may seem just monotonous repetition, the poem itself may seem as dull and mute and inert and unsignifying as the stone in the road. But it finally isn't that for me, because I think it does take you to a place of great fascination and power, even as it seems to embody a searching skepticism about that very procedure, and seems to illuminate that conundrum in the human makeup and the human condition, and on the repetition of the words. Of course, repetition in poetry is a time-honored feature of poetry and technique and tactic. And when you think about poems that repeat whole lines or phrases, we some weeks back looked at Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night," which is a villanelle, and it's the first and just a quick review. The first and third lines of the first tercet in a villanelle then repeat alternately, and then they come together and repeat at the end. So you keep getting these lines again and again and again, and as you proceed through the poem and you acquire more information, maybe there's an event, whatever the poem has for you in both its what it is signifying and in its sound and in its momentum and all its formal properties. The lines upon repetition are changed somewhat. They are enriched by it, and the meaning expands, and it acquires more dimension and point. And that doesn't necessarily seem to be happening here, at least upon a first reading. I mean, we've just been through talking through the whole poem, and I think there is a lot that's interesting there that you can tease out of it. But it doesn't seem to do that. It just seems monotonous. It just seems to signify, to represent struggle and futility, the struggle and futility of a conscious mind to understand something in the world outside of himself. And I think, though, that it does have a kind of music. There is a kind of incantatory, rhythmic, and acoustical, set of movements here, not in the service of resounding significance, but of resounding futility and struggle, the repeated failure to gain access to meaning. So again, sort of the way the symbols are both the symbol of the stone, if it kind of works as one. It represents something, but it undermines the whole idea of representation. The repetitions here add to seem to add to the meaning or the experience, or help illuminate the struggle and the sense of futility that the speaker of the poem is enduring without growing or developing necessarily in the way that you are typically you would be used to or expect in, say, a villanelle. And so I think that's what we have there. One could really go on about this. At first it seems, I can imagine, I've never, taught a literature class anywhere, but I can imagine giving this to a group of students and asking them to read it, or them having come in for class after having read it, and being quite annoyed and wondering what on earth the value of such a thing could be. But hey, that's the magic of poetry. Just live with it a little while and let it sink in, and who knows what'll happen. So with that, I think I will nip it, and I'll read the poem one more time. In the middle of the road. In the middle of the road there was a stone. There was a stone in the middle of the road. There was a stone in the middle of the road. There was a stone. Never should I forget this event in the life of my fatigued retinas. Never should I forget that in the middle of the road there was a stone. There was a stone in the middle of the road. In the middle of the road there was a stone. Thanks. Next time.